All right, well, good evening and welcome to MTSO in this virtual space. Tonight's conversation is presented by the Theological Commons, which is an initiative that brings together our students, faculty, and staff with the general public, along with invited guests and partners in the work for learning and dialogue. This is one way the school fulfills its mission to provide theological education and leadership in pursuit of a just, sustainable, and generative world. Tonight, we present Shades of Green, facilitated by Dr. Tim Van Meter, Associate Professor and Coordinator of Ecological Initiatives at MTSO, who will lead us in the conversation along with the others in this room, and we will allow them to take it from here and introduce themselves.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for the musical interlude. I want to thank friends so much for the folks that have gathered here this evening for this conversation. Good friends all, and excited about the possibilities that this is open. This is the first in a series, we hope, of conversations that lead to deeper educational understanding of connections between the fossil fuel industry, our financial institutions, and how those particularly entanglements keep us from moving forward in helpful ways to save and live more deeply into the life of abundance on this planet. And for each of these folks bring a particular perspective, a particular background, and some significant work to this point in order to bring these questions to us. I'd like to ask for folks to, if you can, to stick around through the end, if not, to let you know to check in afterwards. This is leading to further action, to further engagement on down the line. This is not a one-off event, but it's something that we hope to build in partnership with some folks in this room, some folks not in this room, but with the key groups that are represented here. And so would ask you to remain connected in ways that allow us to build towards some action during Holy Week for Christians, and what is being referred to as the sacred season. So many holidays, the high holidays and high holy days for many religions are converging in April, and others will say a bit more about that. But right now I want to step aside and ask the participants in this panel to briefly introduce themselves and give a sense of how you come into this work. How does this connect with who you are? And I'll just begin with my colleague, Marcia Dinkins, and then we'll go from there. Thank you,
Marcia. Man, I was hoping I'd be like last, but thank you. So thank you. My name is Bishop Marcia Dinkins, and I am so honored to be here with everyone and introduce myself and why fossil fuels is a challenge for me and why am I concerned about climate. So Bishop Marcia Dinkins, I am the part-time executive director for Ohioans for Sustainable Change, formerly Ohio Interfaith Power and Light. And I am in this work. A lot of people, I say to people often, either you are called to this work or you just show up. And there's a difference, because when you are called to this work, things like fossil fuels and the impact of fossil fuels and climate change and environment and all of the other issues that we are faced with, they become almost like it's a layer of your very own skin, because as many times as I've wanted to shake this and leave this work, it's almost like the book in the book of Jeremiah, when he says he feels betrayed by God, and he says, hey, and I'll paraphrase it, when you called me to this office and you told me you chose me before I was formed for the foundation of the world, and my parents had nothing to do with this, and you called me a prophet, I thought that there was something that came along with this calling called protection, maybe a peace of mind and safety. But instead, I got slapped upside my head, spat on, and put in stocks. And I don't want to talk about you anymore. I just can't say anything more about you. And he said, but the words within his belly began to just burn so much that it was like fire shut up in his bones. And so I'm in this work because it's like fire shut up in my bones and on the inside, but on the outside, I see what fire is doing, fossil fuel industry is doing to Black communities, communities of color and poor communities, and the impact that it's had on my very own life, being a single mother who had to raise children in a community that experienced these adverse impacts with regards to climate and environment. So I'm here, one, because it's attached to my calling and I've been called to this office, and number two, because it's my lived experience, and number three, it's like fire shut up in my bones. I'm trying to shake it and let it go, but it just won't let me go. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm in the fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Dinkins. Appreciate that so much. And nobody likes to follow you. And so therefore, I'm going to ask Rabbi Nate DeGroot to please introduce himself next.
Well, thanks, Tim, and it's an honor to follow Bishop Marcia. My name is Nate DeGroot. I am a trans-denominational egalitarian Jew. I am a rabbi. I live in Detroit, Michigan, which is the largest majority Black city in the country and is on Anishinaabeg land. I'm the national organizer for the Shalom Center, and the project that I'm working on, the campaign that I'm working on through the Shalom Center, is called Exodus Alliance, which I'll speak about later. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you all tonight, both the panelists, MTSO in particular, for keeping up a relationship for a number of years now, and to everyone who's in attendance. For me, the challenge of fossil fuels and climate change concern me because at my core, I believe a more whole and more just and more beautiful and more connected reality is possible. And I yearn to live in that world. As a Jewish person, that's what it means to me to live in and as part of a divine reality. That's what the promised land means to me, or the beloved community, or Olam Haba, as we say in Hebrew, the world to come. That's what all of those look like to me. And that world is only possible. It only makes sense to even think in those terms if we are in a more healthy and more intimate relationship with the earth itself. The end result must include that vision, and the process for how we get there must include it as well. And I love nature and grew up playing in the woods and swimming in the ponds behind my house. And I have a 15-month-old, and so I want to be able to be a human in relationship with the miracle of nature and one another for however long I have on this plane. And I also want for my child to have a future where the earth isn't ravishing him and his generation to the point where he does not get to live life, period, never mind live a fulfilling and meaningful life. And the fossil fuel industry and the financial institutions that fund the fossil fuel industry are getting in the way of all of that. And so that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Rabbi DeGroot. Very much appreciate that. And I'd like Reverend Abby Mohawk, please, to introduce herself too.
Thanks, Tim. I'm Abby Mohawk. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Education and Training and the Director of the Climate Finance Campaign for Greenfaith, which is an interfaith and international movement to get people of faith organized, learning from each other, and building a more just, compassionate, and loving world. And I'm here with my 7-month-old daughter, Juniper, who is kind of in between bedtime and eating time. So she's with us tonight. Hi. I come to this work from a variety of places. I'm a PhD student writing about how the Presbyterian Church has been involved with the divestment from fossil fuels movement. I come as a parent, worried about the planet that we're leaving for generations to come, and that those of us who are white have created out of colonization and racism and concerned that that I'm not living faithfully if not everybody is liberated. What Marcia said about the fire in your bones reminds me of another prophet in the book of Jonah. Really feeling like I can't not talk about climate change and climate justice and the complicity of Christianity in the destruction of the planet through climate change. Because if I don't, I might get eaten by a whale, because it's my vocation. So don't want to be in a whale. Do want liberation of all creation. So I'll share more a little bit about what we're doing at Greenfaith in the next round.
Thank you, Abby. Very much appreciate it. And now I'd like to introduce and ask Dr. Joerg Rieger to please introduce himself and his work at Vanderbilt.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. This is such a wonderful group. I'm honored to go last with all these colleagues, and I look forward to the conversation. So my name is Joerg Rieger. I'm a theologian, constructive theologian. I have a chair of theology at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and I also direct the Wendland-Cook Program in religion and justice. Our focus is really on economic and ecological matters, but we always do that intersectionally because we realize that all these issues are related. You cannot separate class from race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and so on. So we keep these things together, but we really want to address these issues of economic and ecological injustice because, of course, those are some of the issues that really bother us today. And those are oftentimes issues that religious communities have a bit more trouble with, especially when it comes to inequality in the economy. One of the things that's important to me in this conversation is this question of who actually is to blame, and we'll talk more about that. But let me say right now that I'm afraid that we're blaming individuals too much. If you think about carbon footprint calculators that many of us use, we might do so not realizing that they're actually promoted by the big businesses, perhaps some of them invented and funded and financed, because the big businesses want us to think that the problem is mainly our own, and then it can be solved by individuals doing things. Now, we certainly have a role. Individuals are important. I'm not questioning this. But as a theologian, I want to ask the bigger questions. This is not just about us. This is about that which is bigger than us. Hopefully in that we can talk about God at some level, but we also need to talk about the powers that be. We need to talk about who's really losing and who is actually gaining here. So at the Wendland-Cook Program, we have long argued that what exploits the planet is the same thing as that which exploits people. So what exploits the planet is what exploits people. And if you think about this, exploitation and extraction are related. So what exploits people is ultimately also what extracts fossil fuels from the earth. And we have to talk about it and we have to think about it, not lamenting it, but trying to figure out what's going on in order to find the solutions. This is why I'm in it. When we talk about climate change, when we talk about emissions, we need to talk about exploitation and extraction as well. If you look at the Paris agreements, you'll see that there's a lot of talk about emissions, but hardly any talk about extraction, and no talk, as far as I know, about exploitation. So these things come together. That's the situation. And then, of course, as a theologian, I want to know, what does religion do? And oftentimes, if we're honest, as Christians, especially, I happen to be a Methodist, we have to admit that Christianity is part of the problem. But once we admit that, we can also say that maybe a religion can be part of the solution. That's, of course, why I'm here. I want to talk about the solutions. But we cannot talk about solutions without actually facing the problems. That's usually a little bit difficult because we want to help, we want to make a difference, but we can't do that really without the bigger questions that I think we'll be raising tonight. I'll put in the chat, we have a blog series at the Wendland-Cook Program that's called Interventions I'll put in the chat a series we just recently did on climate change and capitalism. You can read up some of our work, some of our allies, some of our colleagues who work in other schools. So thanks so much for having me. I look forward to tonight.
Joerg, thank you. I'm having some connection to y'all, and I apologize for that. But in answering the question Joerg began to introduce, could you talk a little bit more about how you understand the work that we're in the midst of together?
Are you putting that to me, Tim? Okay, so I guess I'll go ahead. I've already started to talk about.
I'm sorry.
So there we go. Yeah, Tim. I think.
Yeah.
Everybody was nodding.
Yeah,
so I guess
I'm there. Yeah,
Yeah.
I asked Abby to kind of follow up on the question that you introduced.
Okay, so
what are we up against? Yeah, what are we?
That's right, Abby. You go ahead.
Yeah.
We're up against technology issues, and in equal access to technology. But so I mentioned before that I am doing a PhD on Presbyterians and divestment from fossil fuels, and one of the things that continues to strike me about the relationship between Christianity and the fossil fuel industry is several-fold. And the first is that I'm living in Texas, and Texas is one of the places where fossil fuels were first extracted, but it wasn't the first place. This little fact has completely changed how I think about economy and human rights is and the fossil fuel industry. And that is that fossil fuels were first found in Pennsylvania in 1865 as the Civil War was ending, and replaced the economy that was based on chattel slavery in the United States, which then impacted the rest of the world. And so we went on one extractive, harmful economy we went from one to another. And then we went from that same economy, chattel slavery, that was supported by many Christians, and biblical verses and lots of Christian culture, to the fossil fuel industry, which as it was created was supported by Christian theology, Christian pastors, Christian missionaries, like to the point that missionaries would go to new to them places, before the fossil fuel company workers, to scope out the land and the culture, so that then a company could come in and extract from the land by taking advantage of the people and the place. And churches gave moral authority to oil executives and took the money from executives like Rockefeller, how Rockefeller built up Riverside Church in New York City. And so they were embedded and continue to be embedded. As I said, I'm in Texas, and in our fossil fuel divestment struggle in the Presbyterian Church, it's been Texas Presbyterians who've often struggled with how to extract themselves from an industry that has created so much pain and suffering, but also provides for the life of their congregations. And that cultural embeddedness is one of the things that we're up against, that people of faith, particularly Christianity, has given moral authority and to the fossil fuel industry. And that's, it's 150 years of complicity and permission, culturally and shapes how we enter into the conversation. And Joerg, I really resonated with what you said about how we think that the solution needs to be individuals, but actually it's much bigger than each of us. It's this cultural embeddedness, this social economic system that we can't fix just by like eating less meat or getting a bike and or having fewer children, right? Like that doesn't solve climate change. It's really this changing of the system, organizing people and the will of culture, and realizing that we don't flourish if we rely on an extractive economy. So that's what I'll say. Joerg, would love to hear what you have to say.
Can I respond directly? This is so helpful, Abby. Thank you so much. I agree full-heartedly. This is a bigger issue. It's systemic, it's economic, and it's cultural too. There's though one strange thing I want to point out. Tinker, Native American theologian George Tinker, wrote a book in the 90s, Missionary Conquest, and what Tinker pointed out was that there were these, Western missionaries to the Native Americans in our own country, and they helped. They did all the things that you're talking about, Abby. The strange thing is, they didn't really benefit themselves a whole lot. So somebody else benefited by the missionaries doing all these things. And so my point here would be to say, while the church and Christianity is oftentimes part of the problem, big time, like you described, if we woke up and said, who is really benefiting from this? And maybe we're not benefiting quite as much as, well, we're still benefiting, no doubt about it. But maybe somebody else is raking in the big bucks. Somebody else is, going to be the first trillionaire in history. That would be really helpful. The other piece here is, it's a number that's more and more known, but I just want to put it out there. Currently, those of us worried about CO2 emissions, I think that's all of us here on this webinar, need to realize that 71% of global CO2 emissions are actually the responsibility of 100 corporations. Again, this is a corporate thing. 100 corporations are responsible for 71% of CO2 emissions. Again, that's the systemic issue. Exploitation and extraction are closely related, as I said a minute ago. That has to be kept in mind. But I want to say one more thing before I hand it off here about how Christianity is part of the problem. There have been lots of investigations, and we realize Christianity is part of the problem, right? The two arguments that have oftentimes been made in various ways, Christianity is too much focused on humanity, and that's true. Len White, who made this argument in the 60s, said, well, it's Christianity and it's all of modernity, modern science, capitalism, all of that is too much focused on humanity. That is a problem. We have to see that. And the other one, of course, is Christianity is oftentimes focused on otherworldly issues, or in itself, narcissism. So that's what we have to deal with. That's what we have to overcome. Maybe one more thing here, how everything is related. It's not just Christianity, it's Christianity in a way subservient to these forces of exploitation and extraction. One little piece of history that's probably unknown to most of us. I learned this from a colleague recently, Tara Shireen Rowe, who wrote this book where she pointed out that the Reformation, this is going back now to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, was actually funded to a large degree by mining operations in Germany, where minerals were extracted from the ground. Mining corporations were actually building power, coal, and so on, and that was money that fed back into some of the establishment of religion. So once we pay attention to that, I think we know what we need to talk about, and we know then where we have to do our work. I'm doing this work as a theologian, by the way, so I want to talk about God, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, the church eventually, but we can't do that without looking at those dependencies.
Thank you, Joerg, and thank you, Abby. Bishop Dinkins, both Joerg and Abby talked about who benefits. I wondered if you might say a little bit about that, but also who pays the price, and who thinks about this, and what are we really up against in this battle?
Yeah, Joerg and Amy actually have me over here and asking a lot of questions, and one thing that I'm really, before I answer this question, I'm going into it, that I wrestle with is the naming. We tend to universalize one thing, and especially when we use the word Christianity, but we never really name like what denominations or what cultures or belief systems under Christianity that has been part of this, that has benefited. Because one thing, the challenge is we never know who we're holding accountable. We can give facts, we can give, the information, but if we're not naming, which is one of the reasons why we face challenges, we don't name. And so to really add on to what you said, Joerg, you mentioned exploitation and extraction, but we need to add the word exclusion on there too, because a big problem here is the exclusion, is the fact that it's the exclusion of Black people, it's the exclusion of certain voices, it's the exclusion of the historical context, it's the exclusion of the cultural, the theological, the naming, so that we can begin to really come to a place of how do we address these challenges? How do we confront these challenges? How do we do these? How do we bring voices into the space? And so when I think that's another reason why, when we look at the economical part of it, is that a lot of Black people, and I'll say this just because I'm Black, and I sit in the spaces of a lot of, with Black clergy, or just within communities of color. And I do work with along the Ohio River Valley with the Black Appalachian Coalition. That's part of the organizational work that we do, is that Black people don't see themselves in this space. Black people have consistently been disenfranchised. They have historically been subjected to the environment, be it in agriculture, tending to it, but never benefiting from it. It has been the point of these voices are absent, the stories of the people who suffer the most. We're not talking about those communities because, again, we're not naming. We are just vaguely kind of glossing over a lot of this. And if we're going to talk about things from, I believe it was Rabbi DeGroot mentioned the fact of the promised land or Canaan. If we're going to really speak to salvation, liberation, coming to a place where there is a promise of a life better than what we live in now, or better than what we want to leave for our children, then I think the first challenge that we have to address is the challenge within the own spaces that we sit in. And so while I do believe that it is not just an individual problem, it is a collective problem. But individually, we have to take on some blame. Individually, if we begin to name denominations, we get to hold those denominations accountable. Individually, if we get to name who's being excluded from this particular fight, then we get to bring forth some solutions. Individually, if we begin to bring forth the stories and the narratives and look at the political imagery and the political levers and the narrative that have driven out and created exclusion, or I should say exacerbated exploitation, exclusion, and extraction, then we can begin to then think about these things on a more collective way. One of the biggest challenges that we have, and I said this when I first met everyone, is that had I not been invited to this space, Rabbi Nate and I would have never had a conversation. Reverend Abby and I and Joerg and I would have never had a conversation. And so another part or another challenge that we face is the fact that we do our faith in isolation. We do our work in isolation. We do our conversations in isolation. We do our fighting in isolation, and we tell our stories in isolation. And until we can come to the point of a true exodus, because one thing about the exodus is that it wasn't just 600,000 Israelites. It was a mixed multitude of people that came out, because that mixed multitude had experienced the 10 plagues. And when we can acknowledge that it is a mixed multitude of people, together with the animals and everything within the planet, that it's experiencing the problem that the top 1% or the 71% that you mentioned, Joerg, not only domestically, but globally, is experiencing these problems. When we do that, then we can begin to address the problems. But we can't even change the problem to an issue to even begin to deal with it, because issues is what we can win. Problems is what we have been faced with all of our life, and problems just get bigger. But when we can cut these things down and begin to just prune the tree and cut off those things that we know that's not bringing life, and prune it down to these issues that can bring us life, and we can begin to say, this is the Methodist Church, this is the Baptist Church, this is the the banks that's doing this, and this is who's doing this. Then we can begin to point a finger forward and backward. Forward to those who are benefiting from it, from a capitalistic, and then backwards back to us to say, I too am part of the problem. And then we can begin to identify what a collective solution looks like, so that we can individually and collectively heal from all of these harms. And so I just encourage us, as I close, that the biggest challenge today is, can you come out the cave and name what's really happening? And can you be a part of the mixed multitude that wants to be part of the solutions?
Thank you so much, Bishop Dinkins. Rabbi DeGroot, I think I owe you multiple benefits after this for making you follow Bishop Dinkins twice now. But I would appreciate very much if you can just talk about how you see this fight, how you're working in this through your work with the Exodus Alliance and the Shalom Center, and how you have resonated with what you've heard to this point.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And yeah, thank you to each of the panelists for your additions and building on one another, and certainly Bishop Dinkins, where you just left off. I guess I'll pick up with a strand. I live in Detroit, Michigan now, as I mentioned, but before that I lived in Los Angeles, and I was a rabbi at a progressive spiritual community out there called ICAR. And one Shabbat morning we had a guest speaker, Imam Abdullah Antepli from Duke University. And he said a lot of profound things as he was sharing with us that morning, but the thing that stuck with me the most in the years since I heard him speak was kind of an offhanded comment that he made as a framing for actually something else that he was talking about. But he said that capitalism is the world's largest religion, and it struck me really, really deeply. Because when I think of religion, I think of a system of beliefs, a community of practice, a community of purpose, a way that we orient and prioritize how to live our lives, how to spend our time, where to focus our energy. And I think it's probably true that for most of us, on some level, some really real level, our lives are determined first and foremost by trying to make ends meet by the economic situation that we are in. How would we be able to serve the divine if we didn't have to worry about money? How would we spend our lives? How would we spend our time if money weren't an issue? And so, you know, certainly most of us are not worshiping money. It's not an idol for us, but it certainly defines the vast majority of the way that we spend our days. And then for some, it is idol worship, right? For some, for the 100 corporations that Joerg mentioned, right? It is certainly idol worship. This is their religion. And so I think what we're up against from my vantage point in large part is inspiring the wealthiest humans on the planet, the ones with the most financial and political means, to essentially convert away from the religion of capitalism and to a religion or a worldview that prioritizes people and planet and health and sustainability and collaboration. And so it's upon us to soften their hearts so much that they disavow their deeply held beliefs in favor of something that's radically different. And while certainly, you know, as a rabbi and a preacher and a writer, I would like to believe that a well-crafted sermon or an ecstatic prayer service may do the trick, and maybe it will for some, right? We, the billions of people around the world who are coerced and forced to participate in the religion of capitalism against our will have to exert our collective might through political pressure, shifting of incentives, electoral politics, direct action, and more, for that to shift, for the corporations to shift in the scale and scope that we need them to. And it's maybe those people, the ones who are already yearning for a life of meaning and wholeness that's not dictated by a Western and white system of capital and class, that we can move through our sermons and our prayer services and our actions and our organizing. And you know, I don't want to downplay or gloss over the fact that those who hold power and capital and worship those golden calves are at best unlikely to give up their perceived worth easily. And so we're up against a serious battle, you know, where we'll be asked to take real risk, real bodily risk, professional risk. And the extent to which we can inspire one another and stand in solidarity with one another, name what Bishop Dinkins was talking about, name the names and hold ourselves accountable, hold one another accountable, the extent to which we can strategize and dream boldly and effectively together. I feel like that's the extent to which we'll be successful. And you know, regardless of what success is achieved, that's the kind of world, the kind of community that I want to be building anyways, the kind of people I want to be around, and the type of movement that I want to be a part of. And so, you know, my sense is keep doing it, regardless of what the outcomes may or may not be. I'm happy to pause there. I can talk a little bit more specifics of Exodus Alliance, but I'll pass it on maybe before that.
I do think we want to come back to that here in a second, but thank you all so much. I think about something Joerg said in a classroom that you were leading, that it is easier for me to stand in front of a Christian church and say I don't believe in God than it is, and it will be better accepted than it would be for me to stand in front of that same church and say I don't believe that capitalism will carry us forward. Neither of those statements have to, you know, the belief or disbelief in God is not me making a statement right now. It's making a statement about the commitments of that church. And we have progressive seminaries that have chairs in capitalism and theology. We have it is so deep in those spaces. And so, yeah, I thank you, Nate. That is the core religion to which we all worship. The secondary religion in this state is football, but capitalism is first in this state. I wonder about, we talk about the battles that we're facing and the principalities and powers, the monsters that we're in the midst of. What steps do you all see as kind of ways to think moving towards justice? What steps can we take against these? And I will let anyone who feels to speak to please go say something. Or I will call on somebody.
Actually, I wouldn't mind going, Tim, because I want to respond to what Nate was saying about capitalism as religion. This is part of the work that I've done as a theologian. One of my books in 2009 was titled No Rising Tide, Theology, Economics in the Future. And that was one of the arguments there. And I didn't make it up. This came actually from economists who said quite clearly that top economists these days function like priests because they hold the big ideas before people. They don't even crunch the numbers anymore. They have belief systems that they follow. And those belief systems ultimately guide us without even looking at how this affects people. So Bishop Marcia's point, let's look at who's really affected and how doesn't even count anymore. Unfortunately, that's not just the problem of economics, that's also the problem of theology, because too much theology is being done without really asking these questions, who's affected and how. And so this problem of exclusion that Bishop Marcia talked about is ultimately, it happens unintentionally even, it happens because people are just looking either up into the sky or in their own eyes. This is that narcissism that we find in religion. And so it's not even part of the conversation. However, though, what steps are we taking? Inclusion doesn't solve it, because if you include people into the dominant system, well, it's probably better than being excluded. This is a conversation we had in the 90s with our Latin American friends who were doing liberation theology at the time. They said, if at least we were exploited, but we're excluded. So there's a difference, right? But once you're included, and you're exploited, you're still struggling. That's the story of the African-American slaves. They weren't excluded. They were included in such a way that they were absolutely necessary. The system was totally dependent on slave labor, but it was exploited. It was a matter of life and death. And so that wasn't really the way forward either. So even when we talk inclusion, we still have to ask the question, inclusion into what? The problem with this capitalism as religion, though, is not just that we believe in money or that we somehow depend on money, but that money shapes our images of God. We think of God. Well, what do you think of God? Some powerful individual, probably looks like a CEO or maybe some president that you appreciate, or somebody in power anyways, probably white, male. Those things shape us so deeply that it's not even necessary for capitalism to push real hard, because we do the work ourselves. So that's what I would say is really important as a step to take to make a difference, to bring these things to the surface, to talk about it, to realize how much we're really dependent on these dominant forces and powers and how deeply they shape us, and how that has to change. Now, the way to change it, I think we are already talking about it, right? Become aware of that which you're not aware. Those are relationships, those are people, those are, the people on which this world ultimately rests. Now, you can say, of course, in this country, there's a long history of slavery, sexism, racism, ethnocentrism, and all these things. That's where we have to start looking, but it has to be specific. So it's not just a matter of talking about it, but really talking about the communities that work together. At the Wendland-Cook Program, this is why we talk about labor issues. The 99% we define as the people that have to work for a living. It also just so happens that the 99% is your most diverse group that you can find. It's diversity you don't find as much in our churches. You find it, though, at the place of work. So this is the place where experiences of racism, sexism, and so on come together. And of course, class matters. So if you work through the organizing of the working majority, you might be able to address a few things. You might be able to build power against exploitation, extraction. You might also be able to build power against racism and sexism, because this is where the thing hits home, and this is where so many people are affected by it. So I'll leave it there for now, but I think ultimately organizing solidarity among those who are most affected. The leaders are those who bear the brunt of this in their own bodies. That means people of color, that means, non-Western people, non-male, non-heteronormative and so on. But ultimately, the 99% of us are implicated there as well. And we might come along if we see how we're all affected.
Please, Bishop Dinkins, Marcia, please.
I don't think I necessarily have a major reply as much as I have a question that's a food for thought question. Joerg just mentioned, let me just not put it because it's not a Joerg way of thinking. This is the way we have been, I think we have been conditioned in so many ways, from slavery or life to the present, is that those who are always adversely impacted are always the ones who have to be the ones fighting. The question that I have is, when do we come to a point of those, how do we get to the point of those who are not as heavily affected? And I don't mean the people who sit in the capitalistic system, but then maybe I do mean the people who sit in the semblance of capitalism as well. But it's always like, when do the people who understand or have the access that a lot of these communities don't have access to become frontline fighters? I feel like in this, even when around the statement of inclusion, or the, and I do agree that in a sense, when we think about slaves, it wasn't a point of, it was always interest convergence. When it's in the best interest of whomever to benefit from it, then that person, and we see it now, and bell hooks would call it eating the other. When you can benefit off of it, then it becomes a point of where you want to kind of come in. But the problem is that I think we also have to move past and bring to a point of, and you've spoken to this, Joerg, and I just want to build upon it, is white normativity and how it sits in. And so when we look at white normativity and interest convergence, and the fact that we normalize things, because this has been the cultural aspect of doing things, or the superiority aspect that has been deeply rooted since Socrates and the rest of the elitists who thought that they were the ones who could make the decisions around justice, and who gets to be harmed and who doesn't get to be harmed, who's deserving and who's undeserving, who continues to perpetuate degenerative politics while also trying to define justice to only come to a point that justice really isn't justice, and it's nothing that can be defined, because even a person who deems themselves to be somebody who is of a good-natured social class can also be a good bank robber. So my whole thing is that I get to, and I think I get weary in this, is that the people who are always adversely impacted are the people who have to be responsible for righting the wrongs of the people who caused the problem. And then the people who get to sit in the in-between states, or the stages, I should say, in the suburban areas, because the urban is just another white supremacist culture word or code word, through the bridges of poverty to just set us aside in class. But when do the green tree people who have the green trees in their community begin to fight and join the fight for the people who don't have the green trees, who yet have to pay the most in the light bill, who yet their children have the highest rates of asthma, who yet don't have access to health care, who don't have access to clean air, who, and might I say, through no fault of their own. So do we break?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please go ahead, Bishop.
By all means. No, I'm done.
I wanted to respond because what you're saying is really crucial, and I want to affirm that. I just want to make sure that people didn't hear what I said to say that this is ultimately on the shoulders of those who are most oppressed. I talked about leadership, I talked about guidance, which doesn't mean that this is where all the work has to be done. In fact, I agree that the work has to be done a lot more by others who may have certain resources and certain privileges. But this brings me back to Abby's point of the missionaries. You have these missionaries as middle people. They somehow are part of the problem, huge parts of the problem, but they're not the ones who are ultimately benefiting. And so to activate them, to bring them along, I think more is required than what we're usually calling allyship. What's required is this deep solidarity. I've coined this term, deep solidarity, that ultimately helps people see this is killing you too. It's killing others more, but you're not going to get out of this alive either. And you have a dog in this fight. And thereby, let's talk about who is really benefiting and who's really losing. And if university professors like myself would realize that we're not running this show either, neither are pastors or other, people of privilege. There's a ruling class, there is corporations, and it's not individual CEOs who are the problem, but the system. Maybe we could bring about what you're calling for, Bishop Marcia, which I think is exactly right. We need a much broader group of people getting active here.
I'm happy to jump in as well, and just, really appreciate what's been said and building upon it. I think, speaking as someone who's Jewish, we kind of sit at an interesting place in this conversation. Our community here in the US is maybe 85% or so white, but about 3 generations ago, we were not seen as white. When we were immigrating to this country at the beginning of the 1900s, we were not seen as white. And so as white Jews have become white and become seen as white, what is our standing in all of this, and how do we show up for ourselves and others? This gets at a very deep and long history of anti-Semitism, and the way in which Jews have been placed as a kind of fulcrum between empire and between the masses and the people. And as Jews have felt threatened, and Jews have felt like our position and our place was precarious, we've made choices over the years. Do we side with empire, or do we side with people? And too often, Jews have believed in an impossible choice, I will say, but have believed that we would be safer cozying up to empire. And over again, that has proven to be false. We've been exterminated and killed in the subject of genocide in places all over the world for many centuries. And so I think one of the places where progressive Jews in this country today are trying to really mobilize is to make a different decision, to say that actually we are not safer, trying to gain the approval and the welcoming of empire, but that our safety is reliant upon a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, and being part of the 99%, being part of the popular struggle. And so, I'll speak briefly to how we're trying to do that right now in the role that I'm in, and through the work that we're doing. Our campaign is called Exodus Alliance. I know Bishop Dinkins already spoke to some of the power of the Exodus, but this is really a particular story to the Jewish people found in the book of Shemot and the book of Exodus for us. But it's a universal story that has resonated with different peoples across countries and continents and centuries, for its message of degradation to dignity, of the tightness, the narrows, which is Mitzrayim, which gets translated as Egypt, but really it's the place of the narrows into the place of expansiveness. And so we are organizing a multi-faith coalition to try to bring holy inspiration and sacred hope to the streets this spring at Passover time. We are holding Passover street seders in front of Chase banks and other financial institutions that uphold the fossil fuel industry. These projects of the fossil fuel companies undertake, the fracking, the oil pipeline laying, the digging for coal. They're massively expensive projects, and they're not actually profitable or very profitable. And so these fossil fuel companies actually require the financial backing of the JP Morgan Chases, the Citigroups, the Bank of Americas, as well as the compliance of the asset managers, the Vanguards, the BlackRocks. And so in order for us to try to shift this, in order for us to try to take the lead on what we can do, we are organizing street seders in front of these institutions all across the country this spring, Jewishly led, with multi-faith allies and support and intersections in all of the places where we can. I'll put a link to our website in the chat. And if anyone's interested in getting involved or learning more, our big national action organizing call is actually tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. And if anyone's interested in learning more information and then breaking out into breakout rooms by city or region, so that you can begin to plan, meet the people nearby who are also interested, begin building relationships, and then begin to plan actions where you are. Our hope is to bring this kind of sacred inspiration to bring Jewish wisdom to bear and multi-faith wisdom to bear on this issue, and to get people motivated to continue the work and plug in to movements for change on a structural level that are doing this over a long period of time. We're doing this as a kind of key Jewish expression of the sacred season for climate justice, which maybe Reverend Abby can talk about as well, kind of in coalition with them as well. So I really appreciate that, and appreciate the chance to share a little bit about that campaign.
I have a teething child. I know. Which reminds me of the pain of having to change and grow. I know. So, baby, I know. What Nate was getting at around sacred season. So Greenfaith is a global community. Actually, Tim, I think I might need you to move us to the next question, and I'll come back.
Come back. Thank you. That sounds great. And I honestly think the last question I had is also echoed both in the chat and also in the Q&A. So I'm going to read those questions and ask you all to kind of bring those together in your mind. One is from Pat Atkinson in the chat. So if economic theology leads the world's capitalistic oligarchical control of our resources and the world's future, how do we fight this? And then in the Q&A, I think a very strongly related question: the challenges before us are immense. Do you think we may have crossed beyond the threshold for human intervention to prevent drastic, maybe catastrophic climate change? Where do you see God? Yes or no, where do you see God in your answer? And so I think those are, we're both those are deeply structural questions asking, where does hope lie? Where is God? Yeah.
Can I answer the second question about the threshold? The most recent IPCC report just came out yesterday, I think, and it basically said we're careening towards more and more climate change, and that's hurting all people. All of us are moving into frontline designation, and that the mitigations and adaptations that we have in place so far aren't enough, and we don't have a plan in place to bridge the gap, right? And what that told me is that we're past the place where there is no threshold. She was quiet all through everybody else talking, and as soon as I unmuted, she started crying. I'm so sorry.
No, Abby, don't be sorry. She's expressing all of our emotions right now.
Right.
So I think she's, yes.
But I think what's key from that is that we're past the point. We're past the threshold. Because we're not making the choices collectively and individually that we need to make. And that's what I'll say for now.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you. I wondered if others would like to respond from kind of a theological grounding, a textual grounding. Where are you in this? How do we stand against these massive, massive structures and powers? I'll offer a short thing that when I am with Abby on this. The report is over 1,000 pages, so I've not read it yet. But the space I see possibility is people turning towards each other, is the possible structures of resilience that can come about when people determine that we will take care of interconnected circles. The danger in that is that those people turning towards each other are defined through religion or through ethnic background or through racial backgrounds, and that's the end of us all. But the possibility of resilience is not in the redemption of the structures that are killing us. It's in finding radically new ways forward. And also to resist the gaslighting and greenwashing of almost everything we do. There's 4 corporations that control over 80% of our agricultural outcomes, including Beyond Meat, including all the ways that they're greenwashing a diet for us. And we have to figure out places of resistance to do that. So that's how I think about these, but I would want others. And as far as the question, where is God? If we are a species that can, through our own vision of our importance, create our own extinction, it seems like a pretty massive temptation of the holy, massive disrespect of the holy. So others, Joerg, I see your...
I guess since, I sort of make a living by talking about God, maybe I need to talk about this at least briefly. This question, I think, is crucial. Where is God? But it really has to be addressed in terms of where is God not. And I think it has to be much clearer. It has to be said that God is not where these corporations are. I know this is something that's difficult for liberals because liberals want to see God everywhere. And of course, seeing God everywhere is always better than just seeing God only on our side, only with our club, only with our church. That's also a problem. But to not discriminate and to assume that everybody is always coming in the name of the Lord, I think is part of the problem, because then we cannot see where the alternatives are. The early Christians were called atheists by the Romans for a good reason. The Romans were not stupid. They knew that the Christians were talking about God. The Romans were religiously tolerant. They could tolerate all kinds of gods, include them in their pantheon, but not the Christian God, because the Christian God was different from the empire gods. Christian God wasn't sitting on a throne, didn't look like Caesar, didn't talk like Caesar, and so on. So where's God? I think, if you follow up what you were saying, Tim, it's in those resilient relationships. And that's not an easy answer or an easy way out, but to say, how has God manifested God's self in our lives? In the history of this country, I think this is, we go back, we talked about slavery a moment ago. Well, let's talk about slave theology, the theology of the slaves who were resilient, who overcame. Let's talk about the theology in the grassroots and in the margins. And that's not a platitude. I think that has to be worked out. This is the work, by the way, that we're doing at the Wendland-Cook Program, the theological work, basically saying, you know, there is no easy God talk. There is no way looking up to the sky and hoping for a miracle. Alternatives have to be developed on the ground in the grassroots. So even critiques of capitalism that sort of have easy answers that are anti-capitalist and not working through the hardcore alternatives there are, that includes conversations about, you know, relationships, working people, organizing, labor unions, worker cooperatives, and so on, socialism. Those are theological conversations now, because we have to ask the question, is this where God is? Could this where God be? Part of our work at the Wendland-Cook Program is this is why we work more and more with worker cooperatives, not just to organize labor and working people, but to fight and to develop a different theology, and ultimately to address the problem of climate change from the bottom up. I'll put a toolkit in the chat here that we developed with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development in Nashville.
Thank you. And Bishop Dinkins and Rabbi DeGroot, how are you thinking in these spaces? How are you calling people towards the holy?
I'll let Nate go. Rabbi Nate go, and then I'll go after him.
So the Shalom Center, who I work for, was founded by Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who is an elder in the world of progressive Judaism. He's 88 years old and has written at least 28 books and been arrested at least 27 times, including on his 88th birthday. And one of his theological, we would say like a chidush, kind of revelations or understandings, has to do with the name of God. And in Hebrew, the name of God is 4 letters kind of jumbled together that on the surface don't actually mean anything. Yud, He, Vav, He. And there's no vowels. And so we're always told that we're not allowed to pronounce the name of God, but he kind of took that question differently at a certain point and said, what if we're not actually able to pronounce the name of God? What happens if we try, though? And if you try to pronounce Yahweh and Ha without any vowels, it's breath. And so for Rabbi Waskow, his understanding, which certainly I embrace as well, is that the divine, Yud He Vav He, is the breath of all of life, the breath of all of creation. And so anytime that we're not allowing God to breathe, whether it be from a police officer choking out the life of a Black person or corporations choking out the life of the planet itself, we're choking God, and we're not allowing God to breathe the breath of all of creation. So that's one response in terms of where God is in all of this for me. In terms of kind of hope and that whole realm, I was listening to a Palestinian nonviolent activist speak. I'd seen him speak and known him a little bit, and he was speaking with a group, and his name is Ali Abu Awad. He lives in the West Bank and runs an organization in English called Roots. And someone asked him, where do you hold out hope with all that you've gone through? How do you continue to hope? And he said that for him, hope is strategy, action, and vision. That's how hope is made manifest. That is not some abstract thought or idea, but it's actually the convergence of strategy into action informed by vision. And so I guess I'm as hopeful as I feel like we have strategy. One of my favorite authors and activists and thinkers is Adrienne Marie Brown, formerly of Detroit, and she writes a lot about how we're living within the imagination of someone else. We're living in someone else's imagination. How do we out imagine our competition? I've seen a bunch of pictures pop up with the quote from Dr. King as well. in recent days with everything that's going on, that those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. And so my hope comes from strategy. Today and in the build up to this call and in the midst of Exodus Alliance, I'm feeling relatively hopeful given the connections and relationships and possibility. But I would say it really goes as far as the strategy and vision and action that follows. And the last thing that I'll leave with is I think there's a difference between hope and faith. And in Judaism, faith is emunah. And one of my teachers, Rabbi Eben Leder, taught faith in the following way. He taught about it like a grappling hook that you throw up over a wall, over the turret of a wall, and you don't know whether it really caught or not. You don't know if it's really going to hold. You kind of give it a tug, but you're not up there. You can't see how sturdy it is. And at some point, you just have to make the decision to start taking steps up that wall. And you don't know if it's going to, if the rope's going to give way under your weight. But emunah, but faith is the decision to take one step after another. And so that's how I approach this. I completely agree in terms of relationships, as well as action. And native thinker and speaker Pat McCabe, I heard one speak about in this moment forming lifeboats of coherence. And I feel like in the circles that we find ourselves in the circles that we're trying to create, in the relationships that we have, how do we create lifeboats of coherence that are built on the resiliency that Tim was talking about earlier, and that hopefully will set us up for as much adaptation as we will need going forward.
Thank you, Nate. Bishop Dinkins.
This is a difficult, and I think it's already been said, this is a place where we are all grappling. When you think about the theodicy, and we have to reconcile the power and goodness attributed to God with the presence of evil in the human experience. And, I think the part that we forget is that the human experience has what we call free will inside of it. If we go back to the creation story or to the story in the garden, we always find ourselves asking, why didn't God intercede, or why didn't God intercept, or why didn't God stop? And so what I think in our wrestling is we have to remember that good and evil were, depending on your belief, was something that was unleashed with just one simple bite, with just one simple desire, with just one simple look, because you thought it was good for food, but what was good for food was not good for us. And so we take the word desire, and this is the thing that I think just gives combustion to so many things that just continues to allow things to just be fired up, and the smoke is coming, and it's crap in one way, and somebody's saying it means something good in another way, because of what they think it's giving off or providing for. And so when I think of where is God in this moment, I'm going to say we have to turn back in the mirror and ask ourselves, where are we? Because if we are made in the likeness and the image of God, if we are ones who say, and again, this is where I believe, and there's a scripture that says, greater is he that is in me than he that is in this world. And so what is inside of me? And so what are those things that can be radicalized inside of me to give people hope? And that first thing is love. What we are absent of, and what capitalism has been absent of, is a genuine love, a love that believes. And so when I think of our faith, or where I am in my faith, in my belief, is just that, in the belief. And when we can start believing that everybody deserves, or everybody should have, or we believe that people should have clean air, or people should be able to eat, and people should be able to put food on the table, when we can have a universal belief, then we can start moving some things. And even when I say universal, everybody is, everybody believes in something, and we have something in common in our beliefs. We have threads in common with our beliefs more than we have frayed edges sometimes. But if we just allow the stories, and this is where I think we kind of have to separate the where is God and hope is what sits in the midst of everything else, as it did in the scriptures, is the imagery, is the story, is the narrative. Who are the main actors? Who are the ones carrying it out? And what's in opposition to what? Because what we're going through today is no different than what we see Jesus go through, or what we've seen happen with Noah and the ark, and all of those things, is that the human condition has been set up in some way to respond from both of those places. And this is why when they were in the conversation, the philosophers with justice, is that they could see that we were two sides to a coin. I can show up good one way and you flip the coin, and I can show up bad in another way. And so I just feel like when we are asking this question, where is God? Look at ourselves and ask God. We have to ask ourselves, how do we fight this? The same way we would approach an elephant, one step at a time, one story at a time, one person at a time. It's not going to happen. And I think when we can move from the white supremacist thing of urgency and the right now, that we will be able to see a little more clearly. And it's not just strategy, but what are the tactics that we're putting in place? And how do we move together? How do we get in rhythm with one another? And how do people own up? Because again, we don't get anywhere because, as I said earlier, we don't want to own up to our own parts in this. We don't want to name our own parts. And so even in organizing, while organizing is very powerful, while organizing has helped slaves come out of precarity and contingency and make meaning of their own world, and they had vision, at the end of the day, organizing is still this place where we're hurt, where there's still harm, and where organizing keeps us isolated as well. And so we have to come to this place of, can we all come together? And it goes back to the mixed multitude. Can we all come together for what we want to live, for the world that we want to live in, for what we want to leave Abby's baby and my grandchildren and my grandchildren's children? And that only comes not only when we ask the question, where is God? But we look to our neighbor and say, where are you? Where are you? Where am I? Where are we? Because God gave us power and authority just as much as we want the power and authority of God to be exacted. And so hope for me is seeing love radicalized. Hope for me in this particular point in time is truth. Hope for me is being able to stay right here in this moment and realize and recognize, what does this moment offer? What does this moment gift me to take me into the next? And when we can just stay as far as the lamp unto our feet and the light unto our path lights up and follow that, then we not only will find the pathway to God, but we'll find the pathway to hope. We'll find the pathway to a deeper love. We'll find the pathway to freedom, and we'll find the pathway to solutions. But if all we do is stage our sit-ins, sit in the house and talk, sit in our meetings and talk, sit in the car and talk, sit in work and talk, then we'll just continue to ask the questions, where he is, rather than saying, here I am, or here is. And to me, hope is in the here is, because I get to say, here I am with you and you and you, and here is the solution that I want. Here is the way that I want to live. And here is the legacy that I want to leave my children. Here is God, because here I am.
Thank you all. And thank you. I now know how hard it is to follow Bishop Dinkins, but I feel like I need to say a closing word of deep, deep appreciation for you all. And I see even within the chat, Thank you, Rabbi DeGroot, for that. I think part of what we have to do is, our conceptions of God are a description beyond a horizon that we cannot even understand. There is no words we use that, it's not that they're inadequate, it's that it's our imaginings about an unknowableness. And we need to begin to deconstruct the God of empire, which has certain immutable qualities that maintain empire. And I think it's important to rethink all of those things. And maybe that's another conversation going forward, is beyond a God of the oppressed, what is a God of abundance and breadth and vision and possibility that allows us to live into a renewed world. So thank you all so much for this conversation, for all that you've brought to this evening. The recordings will stand. What I want to do with those folks who are MTSO connected and maybe with other institutions, we've been giving a possibility in front of us of coming, of organizing, of doing some possibilities in relationship with Ohioans for Sustainable Change, in relationship with Greenfaith, in relationship with the Exodus Alliance, and some ongoing possibilities with Wendland-Cook Center. How do we want to respond over the next few weeks to where we stand in resistance to the forces of death and in vision of the God of life? And those questions I leave to students and others who are gathered here of where do we want to stand together? And thank you all so much for this time. We're past time. We're past the promise of what we would do. And this recording will be up within a few weeks for those who want to continue to look at that and share it in other venues too. So thank you all so much. And thank the Theological Commons and all the work that Kathy did in getting this organized and getting it together, and what Danny did in getting the marketing together, and what Liz has done, and just making sure that we continue to talk. Thank you all so much for our time this evening. Peace.